Let your body settle now. Feel the surface beneath you accepting your weight, all of it without condition. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let the breath come in slowly, without effort, and release it even more slowly, like smoke dissolving into a room that has no memory of fire. You're safe here. This story you're about to enter is ancient and far away, and you can hold it gently, the way you hold a stone you've carried a long time, turning it over in your palm before setting it down at last. Breathe in, breathe out. The night is long enough for everything. There was a moment, a single, unremarkable moment, when the galaxy was still whole. Not peaceful, not without its fractures and its long-burning grievances, but whole in the way that a living thing is whole even when it is unwell. The Jedi Order existed. The clones served. The Senate deliberated. The Force moved through 10,000 points of light scattered across 100,000 worlds, and those points of light were people, men and women and beings of no human category, who had given their lives to something larger than themselves, who had trained for decades in the art of stillness, who carried in their chests a relationship with the living universe that no weapon had yet found a way to take from them. In that last whole moment, none of them knew it was the last one. That is perhaps the most devastating thing about it. The Order came through encrypted channels on a night that looked like any other night in the outer reaches of the war. It was not announced. It was not preceded by ceremony or warning. It arrived in the helmet speakers of 3 million clone soldiers simultaneously, a sequence of 2 words and a number: Execute Order 66. And in the pause between receiving the command and acting upon it, something happened inside those soldiers that the Republic's finest scientist had spent years ensuring would happen. A biochip, implanted at the moment of earliest development, suppressed every instinct toward hesitation. The clones did not pause. The clones did not question. The clones turned. Understand what this means. Truly sit with it for a moment. These were not strangers. These were not enemies who had worn hostile faces. The clone troopers who raised their weapons were soldiers who had fought beside their Jedi generals for years. They had shared rations in the cold of Geonosis and the mud of Christophsis. They had followed these same Jedi into situations no sensible being would enter, had pulled them from rubble, had sat beside them in the long nothing of hyperspace, and listened to them speak about the Force with the particular patience of people who believed in something they could not directly perceive. And then, on a night that looked like any other, they fired into those same backs. The war did not end the Jedi. The war was only ever the preparation for the ending. On Megiddo, Ki-Adi-Mundi felt it before he saw it. He'd been moving through a battlefield corridor, the cold blue light of the crystal world falling across his armor, when something shifted in the Force. A pressure, a wrongness, the specific quality of a sudden absence where presence had been. He turned, and in turning saw. The blasters were already raised. The expression behind the visors was not hatred. That is the part that stays. Not hatred, but nothing. The careful nothing of a mind that has been made to be a tool in the moment it is required. He deflected the first volley with his lightsaber, muscle memory doing what consciousness was still processing, but there were too many, and they were too close, and he fell on Megiddo as the blue light came through the crystal spires and made everything look, for just a moment, like something sacred. On Felucia, Ayla Secura was in the open when her troopers fired. There was no cover, no wall to press against, no narrow corridor to control. The planet's jungle breathed around her, enormous and indifferent, its bioluminescent flowers pulsing with slow light that had nothing to say about what was happening beneath them. She was fast, faster than most beings had any right to be, and she spun toward the sound of the first shots with the grace of someone trained from childhood in the architecture of movement. She could not be fast enough. The jungle continued its slow pulse. The flowers did not close. The force felt her go. And somewhere very far away, something registered the loss. A vibration in the web of all living things, one thread going still. On Salakami, Stas Ali rode a speeder through the open plains when the shot came from behind, clean and without ceremony. On Polis Massa, the clones sealed the medbay doors before acting. On Ketone Moidia, Plo Koon's starfighter was struck from behind by the wingmen who had flown beside him through 3 years of war. The explosion a brief brightness against the grey sky, the wreckage falling slowly, turning as it fell, and then the sky was just a sky again. All across the galaxy in a span of hours the lights went out. Not all at once. One by one. That is somehow worse than all at once. All at once has the mercy of scale. One by one means you can count them. In the Jedi temple on Coruscant, there was a sound that those nearby would later describe as silence, but a silence with weight. A silence that pressed against the ears the way deep water presses. The kind of silence that only arrives when something that had always been making a sound stops making it. The force nexus at the heart of the temple had hummed for centuries, not audibly, but felt. A warmth in the walls, a steadiness in the floors, a quality of presence that every force-sensitive being who entered felt as a homecoming. When Anakin Skywalker led the 501st through the temple doors, that warmth did not go immediately. It went slowly, as the fires spread through the archives and the halls, the way a candle goes, not all at once but in stages, the light pulling inward before the dark takes it entirely. Breathe. Let that weight rest somewhere outside you for a moment. You do not have to carry it. You are only witnessing it, from the safety of the night, from the distance of a story that has already been survived, because it was survived, and that survival is what the rest of this telling is about, not the falling, the ones who did not fall. Across the galaxy, scattered among the wreckage of a single terrible night, a small number of Jedi still breathed, some through speed, some through luck, some because they were far from their troops when the order came, in places where the signal took longer to arrive, buying them minutes they did not know they were being given. Some because the Force itself seemed to arrange one more improbable step between them and the blaster bolt, a stumble, a door, a wrong turn that became the right one. Some because another being made a choice, a clone who hesitated a half-second longer than the chip demanded, not enough to save anyone but enough to allow a stumble into darkness. These are the stories that do not make the official records. These are the stories that survive in whispers, in the memories of those who lived to carry them, in the way the Force holds the shape of things that mattered. The Emperor would come to call them insurgents. He would use the word Jedi the way you use the name of a disease, with contempt and with the particular authority of someone who has decided that naming a thing incorrectly is a form of power over it. He would declare them enemies of the peace. He would build an apparatus specifically for their hunting, would fill it with beings capable of tracking a force-sensitive presence the way a predator tracks warmth, would give those beings red lightsabers and purposes that the Jedi had once carried, and now would be used against everything the Jedi had been. He would do all of this because he understood something that the survivors were only beginning to understand, that even scattered, even hunted, even separated from their order and their temple, and their archives and their traditions, a living Jedi was a problem. The Force does not abandon its own, and the Force, it turned out, was not finished. The Jedi who survived the first night faced a specific and terrible clarity that most people who experience sudden catastrophe do not immediately have. They knew, with the Force-enhanced certainty of beings whose perceptions extended beyond the ordinary, that the loss was total. A person who survives an earthquake can tell themselves that help is coming, that the institutions are still intact, that the normal order of things will reassert itself in time. The surviving Jedi could not tell themselves any of those things. The Force showed them the shape of what had happened, not in words, but in the particular absence that the Force communicates through, the weight of 10,000 lives removed from the web at once. They knew there would be no rescue operation. They knew the temple was gone. They knew the Senate had voted itself out of existence, and that the man who now ruled the galaxy was the man who had arranged all of it. They moved through the first hours of the Empire with this knowledge, unshared, unconfirmable, belonging entirely to themselves. The clones, in the aftermath, were not the enemy in any way that resolved cleanly. They had been created for a purpose, grown in vats on a world called Camino, shaped by accelerated aging and genetic manipulation, and years of training into the most efficient soldiers the Republic had ever fielded. They had not asked to exist. They had not asked to be given a chip in their skulls that could override the years of genuine relationship they had built with their commanders. The clone who turned on Aayla Secura on Felucia had eaten beside her. The trooper who raised his weapon at Plo Koon had been saved by Plo Koon's intercession in a battle the trooper might otherwise not have survived. The chip did not erase the memory of this. It simply made the memory irrelevant to the action. There is a specific and haunting cruelty in that, in the idea that love and loyalty and years of shared experience can be made, by the right technological intervention, not to matter in the moment they are most tested. Some clones resisted, not many. The chip was designed with the understanding that resistance would exist, and was calibrated to suppress it in all but the most exceptional cases. But the exceptional cases existed. Clone Captain Rex is the most documented of these, but Rex was not the only one. There were others, troopers who hesitated, who found in themselves some quality that the chip could not fully reach, who paid costs for that hesitation that the official record does not enumerate. The Jedi who survived sometimes survived because a shot was slightly wide, because a moment of pursuit was fractionally slower than it should have been, because somewhere in the architecture of a conditioned soldier, the thing that had actually been that soldier, the specific person grown in addition to the weapon, exerted one last improbable influence. These are not triumphant stories. They are simply true ones. That is where we begin. Not in the temple while it burned, not in the Senate while Palpatine spoke his lies in the careful voice of a man who has rehearsed grief until it sounds like something genuine. We begin in the aftermath. We begin in the scattered dark, among the ones who were still breathing when the smoke cleared and the clones returned to their barracks, and the galaxy began the slow, painful process of forgetting what it had been the day before. We begin with the survivors, not as heroes, not yet, and not all of them ever, but as living beings in an impossible situation, carrying something the Empire had declared extinct, deciding in the private dark of their own minds what to do next. The night is quiet around you. Your breath is slow. The distance between you and everything that ever pressed urgently upon you is very wide right now, and you can let it be wide. We are going back a long time, to a galaxy of strange stars and stranger choices, to a story about what it costs to survive the destruction of everything you are trained to be, and what, against all probability, against all institutional force, survives the fire anyway. Let your eyes close. Let the breath move. We are already on our way. There is a particular quality to the Force that most beings never perceive, not because it is hidden from them, but because the perception requires a kind of stillness that the ordinary demands of living rarely permit. The Jedi spent their entire lives cultivating that stillness, returning to it the way a traveller returns to a known road after days in unmarked country, with the specific relief of something recognized. In that stillness, the Force does not speak in words. It speaks in the way a room speaks before a storm, in pressure, in a change in the quality of the air, in the particular silence that precedes something large. The most experienced Jedi could read that silence the way a sailor reads the water before a wave arrives. And on the night the order came, some of them felt the wave before it broke. Yoda was on Kashyyyk when the darkness arrived in the Force. He was standing at the edge of a Rosha tree platform high above the jungle floor, watching the battle in the canopy below with the stillness of someone who has learned that observation is itself a form of action. The Wookiees fought with the ferocity of beings defending their home, and their home had a sound, the deep vegetable breathing of a forest that had been growing for millennia, the calls of creatures too ancient and too settled in their trees to understand what war wanted with them. Yoda stood inside that sound, and then the Force shifted, not gradually. All at once, like a door closing in a house you thought you knew well, the warmth on the other side suddenly and completely gone. He did not collapse. That is not quite accurate. What happened was more subtle and more terrible than a physical fall. Something in the Force that had always been plural became, in the span of a single breath, measurably less. Not empty, not silent, but reduced. The way a room is reduced when people leave it. The particular quality of presence that 10,000 Jedi lives had been contributing to the living web of the Force contracted suddenly, and Yoda felt each diminishment the way a body feels a wound, not at the surface, but deep, in the place below naming. He steadied himself with a hand on ancient bark and said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing yet to say. The clones came for him before he had fully processed what the Force was telling him. It is possible this was fortunate, that the physical demand of the next few seconds prevented him from experiencing the full scale of what was happening before he had the space to survive it. He moved through the ambush with a speed that surprised even the troopers who had fought beside him, his lightsaber reading intentions before they became actions, his body doing the work that decades of training had built it to do without requiring the mind to authorize each step. He killed 2 clones in those seconds. He would carry that weight separately from all the other weights. The weight of having killed the beings who had just killed his order, who had done it not from choice but from the deliberate erasure of the capacity for choice. There is no clean accounting for that. He escaped into the jungle with the help of Tarful and Chewbacca, Wookiees who had fought beside him and who understood from the quality of what they witnessed that something larger than the ambush had just occurred. They did not ask him what had happened. They moved through the trees in the specific silence of beings who know that silence is the only appropriate response to certain kinds of news. Yoda moved with them, and within him something was being rearranged. The understanding that everything he had known was gone, that the order he had served for 800 years, the institution he had given everything to building and refining and protecting, had been destroyed in a single night. He moved through the Kashyyyk jungle with this knowledge settling into him like stone settling into deep water. He did not stop. He kept moving. That was all there was to do. Obi-Wan Kenobi was on Utapau when his clones turned, and what saved him was something so ordinary it borders on the improbable. Commander Cody had his lightsaber. Obi-Wan had dropped it during the battle against Grievous, and it had been returned to him through channels, and the retrieval of that saber put the communicator in Cody's hand at the moment the order arrived. Cody relayed the command with the same professional cadence he had used for 3 years of battle orders, and in the brief interval between the order and the action, Obi-Wan was standing at the edge of a sinkhole platform, and the blast from the AT-TE knocked him down into the water far below. He fell a very long way. He survived the fall. He swam in the darkness under Utapau until he found a Varactyl to ride, and he rode it through the planet's water-carved passages while above him, the clones searched with the methodical patience of soldiers who have been given a task they do not need to understand. What Obi-Wan felt in the Force during his underwater passage is not a thing he described in clinical terms, because there are no clinical terms for it. He felt the deaths, not each one individually. The scale was too large for that kind of precision. But he felt the reduction, the same contraction that Yoda felt above the Kashyyyk canopy, the sense of the Force becoming less populated, less warm, the living web of which the Jedi Order had been a central and luminous part suddenly and drastically diminished. He swam through dark water with this feeling moving through him, and when he finally surfaced and found the Varactyl and began to ride, the face he wore was the face of someone who has not yet found the words for what has happened, but who knows, with a certainty that does not require words, that the world has changed completely. Ahsoka Tano's experience of the Purge is different from any other survivor's, and the difference runs deeper than circumstance. She had left the Jedi Order months before Order 66 was executed, had walked away from the temple and the council and the life she'd been training for since she was a child, had walked away with wounds that had not fully healed and questions that had not been answered, and a grief that did not yet have a name. She was not a Jedi when the Order came. She was something the Order had no category for, a former Padawan, trained in all the disciplines, shaped by all the years, but carrying none of the institutional identity. She was Ahsoka. Only Ahsoka. She was aboard a cruiser with Rex and a detachment of clones she had come to know and trust over years of shared war when the Order arrived. She felt it through the Force, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, not as information but as sensation, the specific wrongness of something that should be constant beginning to shift. She felt Rex's intention change before his hand moved. This is the particular horror of a Force sensitive in a crowd of people who've been given a command to kill. The ability to perceive what is coming is also the ability to feel exactly how thoroughly the choice has been removed. Rex was not choosing to fire on her. Rex was executing an instruction that had been written into his biology, and Ahsoka could feel the difference between a betrayal and a hijacking, could feel that the person she knew was still in there, behind the chip's control, horrified and unreachable. She fought her way through soldiers she had served beside and would not kill if she could avoid killing them. This detail matters enormously. Other survivors fought their clones with the urgency of people trying to survive. Ahsoka fought hers with the additional weight of not wanting them to die, of treating each engagement as a problem to be solved rather than a battle to be won. She was trying to survive without adding to the losses. In the chaos of a cruiser in pitched internal battle, she found Rex, found some access to the part of him the chip had not fully buried, and she held him by the shoulders, and she told him to fight it. She had no guarantee this would work. The chip was designed to be absolute. But Rex was also designed, over years of actual living, to be Rex, and Rex was stronger than the architects of Order 66 had accounted for. Pause here. Let that settle. The image of Ahsoka Tano standing in a cruiser corridor holding a clone by the shoulders and demanding that he be more than what they made him. Keep that image, because it is not an action sequence. It is a philosophical statement about the nature of personhood, about whether the self can be taken entirely or whether something always remains that cannot be commanded. Rex fought the chip, not without cost, not without anguish, but he fought it. And Ahsoka had a surgeon remove it, not with time to spare, not with any margin for error. And then the two of them escaped a cruiser that crashed into a moon, and they buried the troopers they could not save, and Ahsoka placed her lightsabers on a grave as a marker and a farewell, and a deliberate act of disappearance. She had survived, and she had decided in the same moment to survive as something other than a target. Obi-Wan's escape from Utapau required assistance, and the assistance came from Senator Bail Organa, a man who had been watching the Republic dismantle itself with the grief and the precision of someone who understood exactly what was being lost, and was already, in the hours of the Empire's birth, beginning to think about what came next. Bail Organa was not a Jedi. He was a politician, in the fullest and most dignified sense of that word. A man who believed in governance as a form of service, who had spent his career building consensus in chambers where consensus required more patience than most people could sustain. He had been to the temple the morning after the 500 first moved through it. He had seen what was there and what was not there. He had made his calculations in the specific, steady way that people make calculations when the outcome of the calculation will determine everything, and the calculation had produced a set of decisions from which he would not deviate for the next 19 years. The ship that took Yoda and Obi-Wan from the wreckage of the Republic to whatever came next moved through space in the specific silence of vessels carrying people who have no words yet for their situation. Yoda sat in his seat with the weight of 800 years of accumulated wisdom, and the entirely new weight of having lost in a single night the institution that Wait had been in service of for most of those years. He was not done. He was very clear about this, in himself, with the particular clarity of old beings who have survived enough to know the difference between an ending and a change. The Order was gone. The Force was not gone. The difference between those two things was everything. And in the space of that difference, something new would eventually take shape. He did not know what. He did not need to know what yet. He needed only to be ready when the shape became visible. These three, Yoda, Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, felt the purge in the Force as it happened and survived it. And what connects them is not just their skill or their luck, but their relationship with the Force itself. It gave them the warning that it could not give to those who were cut down without time to turn. Whether that is mercy or simply physics, whether the Force cares about its own survival or merely reflects the living fabric of things, is not a question that resolves cleanly. But the surviving Jedi would have reason, in the dark years that followed, to wonder about it, to wonder if something in the web of all living things had chosen, in the only way available to something without a face or a voice, to hold on to what it could. The thought is not comforting exactly, but it is not nothing either, and in the long dark ahead, not nothing would have to be enough. Let the breath come slower now. You have travelled far already, through the first terrible night, through the force-felt warnings, through the corridors and jungles where the survivors ran. Now the running slows. Now the survivors arrive somewhere, not a safe somewhere, because no such place exists for them, but a somewhere. A room with 4 walls, a bunk in a freighter, a corner of a market on a world whose name they did not know the week before. Now comes the part that history rarely finds interesting. But that was, for the people living it, the most consuming challenge of what remained of their lives. How to be invisible. How to become someone else so completely that the person you had been for every year of your existence simply stops being findable. The Jedi were not trained for this. They were trained for almost everything else. For combat, for meditation, for negotiation and diplomacy, and the navigation of political complexity, and the management of fear and grief and anger. The temple had curricula that had been refined over 1,000 years, covering every skill that a guardian of the peace might require. Concealment was not among them. Concealment was, in many ways, the opposite of what a Jedi was expected to do. Jedi were visible by design. The robes, the lightsaber at the hip, the bearing that came from being told since childhood that you carried something important, and that carrying it was itself a form of service. All of that had to go, not reduced, not modified, gone. And the going of it would prove, for many survivors, to be as painful as anything the blasters had done. Some change their names first, because a name is the smallest and most immediate form of identity, the one that most automatically calls up everything attached to it. A Jedi named something in the temple records became a dock worker named something else, with a family history they had constructed overnight from the raw material of what they observed around them. A common regional name, a plausible origin story, the kind of life that no one investigates because it offers nothing interesting enough to investigate. They practiced these new histories until they could deliver them with the flat affect of genuine boredom, which is the most convincing performance available, because people lie with interest and tell the truth without it. A boring story is a safe story. A boring person is an unexamined one. Clothing was next, then posture, then speech. The Jedi walk was recognizable, not to someone who had studied Jedi specifically, but in the way that any highly trained body is recognizable, moving with a precision and an ease that the untrained eye cannot name but feels as something. Survivors had to learn to walk with weight, with the specific heaviness of people whose lives had not included decades of physical training, whose bodies had not been shaped by lightsaber forms and force-enhanced movement into something that operated outside the ordinary range. They had to learn to be tired in the way that labourers are tired, to sit with the posture of people who have been carrying things all day, rather than people who have been taught from childhood to inhabit their own spines with intention. Some found this easier than others, some never fully managed it, and spent years aware that their body was telling a story their mouth was not. The lightsaber was the hardest thing to relinquish. It was not a weapon in the simple sense that most weapons are weapons. A blaster is a tool with a purpose, neutral in the absence of the hand that holds it. A lightsaber was different. It was built by the person who wielded it, constructed during a ritual that required a deep and sustained connection with the Force, tuned to its maker's specific relationship with the living world. The crystal at its heart was not chosen. It was found through meditation, through a search conducted in the interior rather than the exterior, and the colour it bled into the blade was the colour of that specific, unrepeatable connection. Giving it up was not like giving up a possession. It was more like being asked to give up a particular quality of self, not a part of the body, but a part of the relationship between the body and the universe. Most survivors did it anyway. They buried their lightsabers in compartments, under floors, and in the sealed cracks of walls, wrapped in cloth against the moisture of years they could not count. Some never retrieved them. The suppression of force sensitivity itself was, for the most deeply trained survivors, a spiritual exercise of the most demanding kind. The force does not stop flowing because you ask it to. Closing yourself to it is not a wall you build. It is a discipline you maintain, moment by moment, an ongoing decision to not perceive what you are built to perceive. Imagine being asked to stop noticing temperature, not to complain about it, not to act on it, but to genuinely and continuously not register it. Now imagine that temperature is also the thing that tells you when someone near you is about to act with violence, is also the medium through which your grief and your love and your sense of the world's aliveness all travel. To shut it down is not protection, it is amputation. And yet this is what the hidden Jedi did day after day in order to remain undetected. The Inquisitors, when they eventually came, and they always eventually came, moving through sectors with the specific persistence of searchers who have been given unlimited time and institutional support, were hunting for exactly the thing the survivors were suppressing. A force-sensitive presence has a texture in the living web. It does not announce itself loudly, but to someone trained to find it, it is detectable the way a warm object is detectable in a dark room, not visible, but present, giving off something that careful instrumentation can locate. The hidden Jedi knew this. They lived with it. They lived with the knowledge that the very thing they were made of was the thing that could end them, and they maintained their discipline not with the calm of people who have made peace with their circumstances, but with the grinding vigilance of people who cannot afford the cost of a single, unguarded moment. Ferren Bar hid in the caves of Mon Cala, continuing to train Padawans in the belief that survival without purpose was not survival. Nak Med put down his lightsaber and opened a medical practice on a world that needed doctors more than it needed Force users, treating the sick with the steady hands of someone who had learned early that the Force expresses itself equally through combat and through care. Quinlan Vos moved through the underworld of the galaxy with the specific fluency of someone who had always been more comfortable in shadows than in the temple's halls. Each of these choices was a form of answer to the same question: who are you when the institution that named you is gone? And each answer was different because the question is only ever answered individually, by the particular person living in the particular situation, with a particular combination of skill and damage and hope that no two beings carry in the same proportion. What the hidden Jedi had in common was not a strategy, but a relationship with time. The Empire was built on the assumption that it would last forever, and the Jedi who survived operated in the beginning from the same assumption that the Empire's lifespan was their own, that they were not waiting for something but simply enduring indefinitely. This understanding shifted for most of them over years. The endurance became something else, something more intentional. Not the passive surviving of people who have nowhere to go, but the deliberate survival of people who are, without quite naming it, holding something in trust. They were carrying knowledge and skill and the lived experience of what it meant to be in genuine relationship with the Force, and they were carrying it forward through time toward a moment they could not see and could not guarantee. Think of what that costs, not for a week or a year, but for a decade, for 2 decades, maintaining an identity that is not yours, suppressing the thing you are made of, watching a galaxy reshape itself around an order whose foundations are constructed from lies, knowing that the truth is real, and that knowing the truth puts you in lethal danger, and that the only protection available is to act every day as though you do not know it. The psychological literature on extended undercover work, in our own world, in our own time, suggests that the maintenance of false identity causes damage that does not resolve when the false identity is finally set aside. The self that wore the disguise is changed by the wearing. The hidden Jedi were changed. They could not have been otherwise. The practical realities of the hidden life accumulated in ways that the abstract decision to hide could not fully anticipate. Money was one of them. Jedi did not carry credits in meaningful quantities. The Order provided for its members, and the providing was so complete that the individual Jedi rarely had occasion to manage the mechanics of economic survival. A survivor stepping out of that provision into the galaxy's economy had to learn, quickly and without instruction, how to earn, how to spend, how to exist inside the financial structures of the ordinary world without leaving records that drew attention. Some learned trades. Some found employers who paid in kind rather than credits in the agricultural or industrial economies of remote worlds where formal record-keeping was minimal. Some took jobs that the galaxy did not look at closely because the galaxy had decided a long time ago that certain kinds of labour were beneath its attention. All of them developed over time the particular economic fluency of people who have learned to be financially invisible, which is also the fluency of people who've learned how much of ordinary life is structured around being findable. The Force itself presented a specific and recurring challenge to concealment that no amount of external disguise could fully address. Force sensitivity is not a choice. It is a quality of being, present in every cell, expressing itself automatically in the reflexes, the perceptions, the instinctive responses that a trained Force user carries in their body, the way a trained musician carries rhythm. A survivor standing in a market on a busy world surrounded by the compressed press of hundreds of beings would feel the crowd in a way that ordinary market-goers did not, would sense the emotional weather of the space, the intentions moving beneath the surface transactions, the occasional sharp brightness of a strong emotion cutting through the general static. To not respond to this, to maintain the expression of someone who perceived only the surface of things, required a sustained performance that never had an offstage. There was no private space in which you could be yourself. The performance was the self during the years of hiding, and keeping it consistent required a vigilance that does not have an equivalent in lives that do not require it. And yet, consider the ones who reached the other side of that long eclipse. Kanan Jarrus standing in the dawn of a rebellion he had not expected to find. Consider Ahsoka Tano stepping into the role of Fulcrum with eyes that had seen decades of hiding, and had decided that hiding was, at last, a form of preparation rather than an ending. Consider what they had preserved, not just in the sealed compartments beneath floors, but in themselves. The knowledge of the Force, the ability to pass it on, the proof that the Order's wisdom had not burned entirely when the temple burned. They had hidden, they had paid the cost of hiding, and they had come out the other side carrying the thing they had spent all those years protecting. That is not a small thing, that is not nothing. That is, in the fullest sense of the word, a kind of victory, measured not in battles but in years, in endurance, in the daily choice to keep going when the keeping going was the whole of what was available. The night does not require you to do anything with what it holds. Let your breathing settle. Let the heaviness in your limbs be simply that. Heaviness. The body's way of reminding you that you are a physical thing in a physical place, resting, unhurried. We're going into darker territory now, not because darkness is the destination, but because the story demands we understand what the survivors were running from. You can hold this the way you hold something uncomfortable with curious hands, at a distance, with attention, without being required to absorb it into yourself. Breathe out. We go slowly. The Emperor did not believe the purge had been complete. This was not paranoia. It was an accurate reading of probability and of the Force. He had spent decades studying the Jedi, had worked within their structures and their politics and their institutional blind spots with the patient precision of someone disassembling a machine from the inside. And he knew what they were capable of. He knew that some portion of them would have survived, through distance, through luck, through the Force itself arranging improbable outcomes in favour of its own continuity. He knew the scattered survivors would not mount an immediate challenge. They were too few, too shocked, too severed from the structures that had given them coherence. But he also knew what a single trained Jedi, given time and purpose, could become. He had, after all, built his entire plan around exactly that understanding. The Inquisitorius was his answer to the problem of Jedi who refused to die. It was not an improvised response. It was a designed one, constructed with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized everything the Emperor built. The organization had a structure, a hierarchy, a training program, and a philosophy that was itself a kind of weapon. Its members were given numerical titles rather than names. The Grand Inquisitor, the Second Sister, the Third Brother, the Fifth Brother, the Sixth Brother, and so on. A deliberate erasure of individual identity that served multiple purposes simultaneously. It removed the complications of selfhood, it made the hierarchy legible at a glance, and it communicated to both the Inquisitors and to those who learned of them that the individual inside the title was of secondary importance to the function. They were not people assigned to jobs. They were jobs given temporary occupancy of people. Most of the Inquisitors had one thing in common before they became what they became. They had been Force-sensitive. Some had been Jedi, or Jedi initiates, or Padawans, people who had grown up within the Order, who had known the Temple's halls and the feeling of the Force moving cleanly through a life dedicated to its service. This is not incidental. It is essential. The Emperor did not recruit the Inquisitors from outside the Force tradition, because outside the Force tradition there was nothing to offer. What he offered to the people he recruited, or broke, or both, was not simply power, but a specific and seductive reframing of power's relationship to pain. The dark side, as Palpatine taught it, did not ask you to stop feeling. It asked you to use feeling differently, to draw strength from fear and anger and grief, rather than moving through them and releasing them as the Jedi taught. For someone who had been carrying wounds that the Jedi's emotional discipline had not healed, this was not a temptation in the abstract. It was a door that opened directly onto the specific room of the specific pain. The Grand Inquisitor had been a temple guard, one of the silent masked sentinels who stood at the entrances to sacred spaces and maintained order in the halls where the younglings trained. He had served the Order with what appeared, from the outside, to be absolute devotion, the kind of devotion that asks nothing in return and requires nothing beyond the opportunity to serve. What was happening inside, beneath the mask, was something more complicated. He had perceived things, inequities in how cases were decided, in how certain knowledge was protected and certain knowledge was withheld, in the ways that the Council's wisdom sometimes calcified into the Council's convenience. He had not acted on these perceptions. He had maintained his post and his silence and his mask. And when Darth Vader came to the temple, in the smoke-filled hours of Order 66's aftermath, and offered him a choice that was not entirely a choice. Something in him that had been waiting for permission to feel what it already felt found its permission. The training the Inquisitors received was a corruption of the same foundations the Jedi had built. They studied lightsaber combat, not the traditional Jedi forms in their fullness, but a specialized approach designed for a specific purpose, not to defeat equals in honorable contest, but to break and capture and kill Force sensitives who were already compromised by fear and isolation. Their spinning, double-bladed lightsabers were intimidating by design, built to overwhelm rather than to engage, to create the psychological experience of hopelessness in a target before the physical engagement was fully joined. They were good at what they did. They had been made to be good at what they did, and what they did had a clarity of purpose that the dark side always offers, a straight line from intention to action, with the complications of mercy and doubt removed by design. Sit with this for a moment, and let it be uncomfortable in the way that true things are sometimes uncomfortable. The Inquisitors were not born into darkness. They were made into it, made by someone who understood that the most efficient tool for hunting Jedi was a being who had been a Jedi, or close to one, who knew the feel of the Force from the inside, who understood the specific quality of a Force-sensitive life, who could track the suppressed warmth of a hidden Jedi, the way a former lover recognizes the particular way a person moves across a room. They were victims of a system before they were agents of one. That does not excuse what they did. It does not absolve the choices, some of which were made with full knowledge and genuine will, but it does explain the architecture of the tragedy. The Emperor did not only destroy the Jedi Order, he built his hunting apparatus from its wreckage. The fifth brother was blunt in his methods, relying on strength where the Grand Inquisitor relied on precision. The second sister, Trilla Suduri, who had been a Padawan once, who had been captured and broken under interrogation, and rebuilt into something she had never meant to become, carried her past inside her work with the particular ferocity of someone trying to outrun what she knows about herself. When she finally faced her old master Sarah Yunda again, years after their separation, the encounter was not a villain confronting a hero. It was two people standing in the rubble of the same catastrophe, having made different choices under pressures that were not identical but were both real. That moment, brief as it was, contains more of the truth about the Imperial era than most confrontations between its participants. The survivors knew the Inquisitors were coming. They did not always know when or from which direction, but they knew the texture of being hunted, the sense which the Force provided with merciless clarity of attention moving toward them from somewhere they could not yet see. Some survivors became very skilled at leaving a world before the attention arrived fully, carrying nothing that could not be replaced, moving with the practiced efficiency of people for whom departure was a rehearsed event. Others stayed in one place long enough to put down small roots, a relationship, a reputation, a community that mattered, and then were forced to choose between the roots and the survival. Most chose the survival. Most would carry the grief of that choosing for years. What the Inquisitors represented functionally was the transformation of the Force itself into an instrument of state terror. Under the Republic, Force sensitivity had been a thing that called you towards service, toward a life in the temple, toward the long apprenticeship of learning to be useful to the living world. Under the Empire, Force sensitivity was a warrant for your arrest and a tool for your destruction. It could be tracked, hunted, weaponized, and eventually turned against others who shared it. This was not an accident of policy. It was the point. An emperor who had himself bent the Force toward his own will understood perfectly well that the Force, left in the hands of trained Jedi, represented the only real threat to his continued authority. The Inquisitorius was not just a hunting organization. It was a message that the Force itself belonged to him now, and that any being who claimed otherwise would be found. Darth Vader's relationship with the Inquisitorius was not that of a colleague or a peer. It was the relationship of an architect to a tool, precise and functional and without sentiment. He trained them. He tested them. He occasionally killed them when they failed in ways that he judged to be indicative of fundamental inadequacy rather than circumstantial setback. This practice, which reads as straightforwardly brutal, had a logic that the dark side's philosophy made coherent. An inquisitor who could be defeated by a half-trained survivor was an inquisitor who had not fully become what they needed to be, and an inquisitor who had not fully become what they needed to be was a liability in a program whose entire purpose was the elimination of liabilities. Vader did not mourn them. He noted the failure and adjusted the program. There is a particular coldness in being managed rather than valued, and the Inquisitors lived inside that coldness every day. The Second Sister's story deserves more than a passing mention, because it contains the seed of the program's deepest flaw. Trilla Suduri had been a Padawan who was captured by Imperial forces and interrogated until she broke, until she revealed the location of the Jedi who'd been hiding her and others, and those Jedi were found and killed. And the guilt of that disclosure was built into the architecture of who the Second Sister became. The Empire gave her that guilt as a tool, because the dark side works well with guilt, because guilt and anger are adjacent territories, and someone who cannot forgive themselves can be directed toward the object of that self-reproach with remarkable reliability. When the Second Sister hunted Jedi survivors, she was also in some part of herself that the mask covered but did not extinguish, hunting the version of herself that had broken under interrogation. The Empire was very good at this particular construction, but messages, like all things built by people who believe their power is permanent, have a way of reaching the wrong ears in the wrong order. The survivors heard the message. They understood what it meant, and some of them, in the deep quiet of their hidden lives, began to prepare responses that the Empire had not included in its calculations, responses that would take years, sometimes decades, to deliver, but that would arrive in the end with all the accumulated weight of everything the Inquisitors had been sent to prevent. The galaxy is a very large place. The Emperor's reach was extraordinary but not infinite, and the Force, which has no allegiance to any government, was still moving through every living thing, still connecting, still holding the shape of what had been and the potential of what might yet be. The hunters were real. The threat was real. The hunted were still breathing. And the Force does not grieve the way people grieve, does not rage or despair or collapse under the weight of what has been lost. It simply continues, the way rivers continue, the way the deep roots of forests continue below the level where fires burn. The survivors moved through the Empire's dark with that continuity underneath them, and sometimes, not always, not reliably, but sometimes, it was enough to feel it there. Breathe in slowly. Let the weight of your own body be the whole of what you notice for a moment. The specific gravity of your hands, the warmth where you're resting against something solid. The story we're entering now is a personal one, not the story of a battle or a purge or an institutional catastrophe, but the story of a boy who watched his master die and ran, and of the man that running made him, and of the long, strange road back to something that still had no name but was, in the end, more honest than the thing he had run from. Some of the heavier stories are the ones that begin with the single moment of being too young to know what to do. His name, before it was Kanan Jarrus, was Caleb Dume. He was 14 years old on the day the Empire was born, a Padawan still learning the forms, still building the relationship with his lightsaber that would eventually become the fluency of a master. He was on Kala with his master, Depa Billaba, when the clones turned, and Depa Billaba died so that he could run. This is the primary fact of Caleb Dume's life, the foundation from which everything that followed was built, and it has the irreducible simplicity of catastrophic events. She stood between him and the blasters, and she told him to run, and she did not run herself, because running herself would have meant him dying, and she had made the decision that this was not the acceptable outcome. He ran, he survived, and he spent the next 15 years trying to figure out what to do with the survival that had come at a cost he had not agreed to pay. Depa Billaba was not a minor presence in his life. She was the organizing principle of it. She had selected him from the temple as her Padawan, after her own long recovery from injuries sustained in a battle she had barely survived, and the choice had not been made lightly. She was a master with a specific and hard-won understanding of what the Force cost and what it could not be asked to bear indefinitely, and she had recognized in Caleb Dume a particular quality, not just strength in the Force, which was obvious, but a quality of connection, a capacity for genuine relationship that she believed would either make him exceptional or destroy him, depending on how it was shaped. She had spent the years of their training shaping it carefully, and then she had spent her last moment spending it entirely, giving every year of that care in a single act that left no change. The running, in the immediate aftermath, was purely physical. Caleb Dume moved through the forests of Kala with the animal clarity of someone whose nervous system has simplified all questions into one. Away. The Force helped him, could not stop helping him, because the Force does not abandon its own even when the person it is helping would very much like to be abandoned. And he moved through the trees with a speed and an instinct that kept him ahead of the pursuit. He found passage off-world in the way that desperate and resourceful 14-year-olds sometimes find passage, through misdirection and improvisation, and the specific willingness to agree to anything that gets you onto a ship and off the planet where the thing happened that you cannot think about yet. The years that followed Kala were years in which Caleb Dume dismantled himself with considerable thoroughness. He changed his name. Kanan Jarrus, an identity assembled from pieces with no connection to anything that had come before. He buried his lightsaber. He stopped meditating. He stopped reaching for the Force in the morning the way he had reached for it every morning of his life since childhood. The familiar greeting between the person and the thing that moves through all persons, and he replaced it with a studied blankness that was not peace but was at least something the Inquisitors could not track. He drank. He worked. Cargo runs, odd jobs, the anonymous labour of the space lanes, which require enough attention to prevent the mind from settling in any one place too long. He became, by careful increments, someone who had never been anything at all. There is a question underneath all of this, and it is worth sitting with before we move on. What was Kanan Jarrus actually afraid of? Not the obvious answer, not the Inquisitors, not the Empire, not the physical consequence of being recognized. Those fears were real, but they were the surface. The fear underneath was more specific and more paralyzing. The fear that using the Force, connecting to the thing his master had given her life so he could live to use, would be a form of claiming an inheritance he had not earned and had not asked for and did not know how to carry. To pick up the lightsaber was to accept the position of Jedi in a galaxy that killed Jedi. It was also to accept the position of survivor in a story where the better person had died, He was not ready to do either, so he kept it buried. He kept himself buried with it. What disrupted the burial was not a revelation or a philosophical resolution. It was, characteristically for the way the Force operates in human lives, a set of circumstances that made continuing to be buried more expensive than the alternative. He found people, or they found him, which amounts to the same thing in Force-sensitive lives, people in specific and particular danger that he was specifically and particularly equipped to address. Hera Syndulla with her convictions and her ship, Zeb and Sabine and a Lasat warrior, and a Mandalorian artist carrying their own versions of the same question about what to do with a past that doesn't fit cleanly into the present, and a child who could feel the Force and who was feeling it alone, without a guide, the way children feel things that are too large for them, with a rawness that could go wrong in a dozen ways if no one was there to receive it. The child's name was Ezra Bridger. He was street-smart and defensive and had built his survival on the same foundations Kanan had built his: self-reliance as armor, connection as risk, attachment as the specific vulnerability you eliminate first when the galaxy teaches you that attachment leads to loss. They recognized each other in the way that mirrors sometimes recognize mirrors, not with immediate comfort, but with the uncanny sensation of seeing your own structure from the outside. Kanan had not intended to teach anyone. He had not intended to admit even to himself that there was something to teach, that the training was still in him, that the 15 years of deliberate forgetting had not actually erased anything but only covered it, the way soil covers a seed without eliminating it. He retrieved his lightsaber. This sounds like a small action in the summary. In the living of it, it was anything but. He had to go back, not literally to Kala, but in the more demanding sense, back to what he was, back to the identity he'd been trying to leave in the forest on the night Depa Billaba died. He had to acknowledge that Caleb Dume and Kanan Jarrus were the same person, that the training was not a past self but a present one, covered in 15 years of deliberate forgetting but not gone, that his master's sacrifice had not been a gift he could decline by not using it, that the running had been necessary and had served its purpose, and that the purpose, apparently, was this: standing on a ship with a child who needed guidance and a crew that needed protection, in a galaxy that still needed the thing he'd been trained to offer. The moment he began to teach Ezra, something unexpected happened that Kanan had not anticipated and could not have anticipated from behind the wall he had built. He began to remember things he had not known he still had. The forms came back not as intellectual retrieval, but as physical memory. The body's knowledge, stored in muscle and bone, retrieved by the demands of demonstration rather than the efforts of recollection. He would show Ezra a stance and feel in the showing the specific quality of attention that Depa Billaba had brought to the same instruction years before, the particular way she had corrected him, not by telling him what was wrong, but by placing her hand on his arm at the exact point of misalignment, and waiting for his own sense of the form to register the difference. He was teaching his apprentice the way his master had taught him, using methods he'd not consciously preserved and could not have described if asked, because they had been kept somewhere below the reach of the forgetting. The question of whether to call himself Kanan's master, whether to give Ezra the formal title of Padawan and thereby reconstruct, in however diminished a form, the lineage that the Empire had tried to sever, was one that Kanan circled for a long time without landing. The reluctance was not dishonesty. It was a form of protection, directed partly at Ezra and partly at himself. If he named the relationship, he accepted the full weight of what the naming meant, that he was a Jedi in a galaxy that killed Jedi, taking on the responsibility of shaping a Force-sensitive being through a tradition he had spent 15 years trying not to be associated with. That was a very large thing to accept, and yet the relationship was already what the title would have named. The naming was only formality, and the formality, when it finally came, had the quality not of a decision made, but of a recognition acknowledged. They were what they were. The word was just the word. He was not a perfect teacher. He was, in fact, a deeply imperfect one, uncertain of his own standing, teaching forms he had not practiced in 15 years, navigating the emotional territory of a master-Padawan relationship, while simultaneously being unwilling to use those words, because using those words would mean fully accepting what had happened to the last relationship he had carried by those names. The Ghost Crew watched him work it out with the patience of people who have their own unresolved things and recognize the process. Hera in particular understood what was happening with a clarity that she did not always voice. The way perceptive people sometimes choose not to name the thing they see because the naming would force a resolution before the person being named is ready for it. What Kanan Jarrus ultimately teaches, not to Ezra alone, but to anyone who holds his story with care, is that survival and purpose are not the same thing, and that the gap between them can be crossed, but only by going back through what you ran from. He ran for 15 years. He had to run. There was no other option at 14, on a forest moon, with his master already gone. The running was not cowardice. It was survival. But survival was not the end of the story. The end of the story was the moment he stopped moving long enough to feel what he was carrying, to acknowledge that the Force had kept him alive for something, and to decide that the something was worth the cost of acknowledging it. He made that decision imperfectly over time, with help he did not ask for and needed badly. He made it in the company of people who had their own versions of the same decision pending, their own versions of the question about what to do with a life that had been preserved before it knew what it was being preserved for. The Ghost Crew was not a Jedi cadre. It was something more improvised and more durable, a collection of people who decided that what they were going to do with their survival was to use it for something. Kanan arrived at that decision alongside them, and the arriving was the point. That is, in the end, the most honest version of how that kind of decision ever gets made. The darkness behind your closed eyes has its own quality tonight. Not empty, but full. Full the way deep water is full, with all the weight of everything that cannot be seen from the surface pressing upward, with a patience that has no urgency because it has no deadline. Rest into that fullness. Let the breath move through you without directing it. We're going to a salvage yard on a planet called Bracca, where a young man with red hair and careful eyes is dismantling the bones of the Republic's war fleet with practiced hands and a face arranged into the specific expression of someone who has decided that having no expression is the safest possible approach to a situation he cannot change and must survive. Cal Kestis was 9 years old when Order 66 came, which means he was young enough that the years before it have the quality, for him, of a different world. A world so completely ended that accessing it requires something more like archaeology than memory. He had been a Padawan at the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, learning under Utapau, a Lasat Jedi Master whose physical size was matched by a philosophical largeness, a willingness to sit with complexity that had made him, over the years of their training, exactly the kind of teacher that a young and somewhat reckless Padawan needed. Utapau had taken Cal's specific qualities, his impulsiveness, his courage, his relationship with grief that expressed itself as action, and had been carefully, patiently working with them rather than against them. The training had been going well. It wouldn't get the chance to finish. They were aboard a cruiser in hyperspace when the order came, and the clones moved through the ship's corridors with the systematic efficiency of an order being executed by organisms that had been designed for efficiency. Utapau fought his way through the ambush with a power and a ferocity that bought time rather than salvation, and the time he bought was the time required for Cal to reach an escape pod. This is the structure of his survival story. A master who was larger in every sense, who used that largeness as a shield and a door and a final act of direction, pointing his Padawan at the only remaining open space and saying, without ambiguity, that the direction of travel was away. Cal escaped. Utapau did not. What is distinctive about Cal Kestis's particular wound is not just its depth, but its specific character. He had been with his master in the moment of betrayal. He had not simply felt the loss through the Force from a distance, the way some survivors felt the great dimming of the Jedi as something atmospheric and overwhelming. He had seen the specific faces behind the visors. He had felt his master's pain, and his master's will to shield him had been inside that Force connection in the moment it ended. He had been, in the truest sense, present. And presence at a trauma of that kind leaves a particular kind of mark. Not just the wound of loss, but the wound of witnessing, which is its own category of scar. Bracca was the planet he found, or that found him, in the years that followed. It was a world dedicated to the disassembly of things, specifically of the ships that the Clone Wars had produced in their hundreds of thousands, the massive hulks of Republic Star destroyers and battle cruisers brought here to be stripped for parts and raw material. Cal worked as a rigger, attached to a crew of scrappers who asked no questions about origins and required only the ability to do the work. The work was physical and demanding and specific, cutting through durasteel plates in the particular order that kept the structure stable while being reduced, climbing through passages that the original designers had built for droids rather than humans, developing an intimate knowledge of the architecture of ships that had been built to carry Jedi into battle and were now being unmade piece by piece. There is something that needs to be considered here, something about the specific choice of Bracca, even if the choice was shaped more by necessity than intention. Cal Kestis spent 5 years dismantling Republic warships. He spent 5 years learning the interior architecture of the fleet that had carried the Jedi to their deaths, pulling apart the bones of the world that had been, handling its wreckage with his bare hands. Every day of those 5 years was a form of contact with the material remains of what he had lost. Whether he processed this consciously or not, whether the repetition was a form of mourning or a form of punishment, or simply a form of survival that happened to take that shape. The years on Bracca were years in which grief wore the costume of labour, in which the interior work of loss was done, whether or not it was named as such, through the physical work of taking apart the things that grief had made of the world. He had shut his Force connection down in the way that traumatized people sometimes shut down the parts of themselves most associated with the trauma. It was not a philosophical discipline, the way it was for some survivors. It was a reflexive closure, a door that had been slammed in the immediate aftermath of the ambush and had not been opened since, maintained less through active effort than through the specific numbing that follows overwhelming experience. He was not suppressing the Force. He was not reaching for it and stopping himself. He was not doing it at all, the way a person with a badly injured hand stops using that hand, not as a decision but as an automatic response to what happens when it is used. The Force was still there. He was simply somewhere else. The accident that revealed him, a fellow rigger falling from a scaffold, Cal's hand reaching out before his mind could authorize the action, the Force catching the falling body in a way that no unaugmented human hand could have managed, was, in the precise sense of the word, accidental. He had not chosen it. He had been betrayed by his own deepest training, the instinct to protect that the Jedi had built into him over years of drilling it into the space below conscious decision. His hand moved before he thought. The Force moved through the connection before he could close it, and the moment of exposure, watched by a workmate who reported it to the Imperial authorities, who were always watching for exactly this kind of anomaly, set the events of the next weeks into motion with the inevitability of falling. What followed was a journey that is easier to describe in terms of its emotional architecture than its geographic one. Cal Kestis, in the days and weeks after his exposure, was forced to do the thing he had spent 5 years carefully not doing. He had to go back into his connection with the Force, back into the memories that the Force held of what he had been, and what had been done to him, and what his Master had given him, and why. He had to relearn forms that he had learned at 9 and practiced at 9 and then locked away, finding them still in his body with the slightly eerie fidelity of muscle memory, which does not forget even when the mind is trying to. He had to accept that the training was not a past life but his actual life, carried forward through 5 years of deliberate separation, waiting for him to be ready to claim it. Seri Junda was the person who found him, or found him again, depending on how you count the years of non-finding as a category. She was herself a survivor, a Jedi who had experienced her own version of the door slamming shut on the Force, her own years of deliberate severance from the thing she was made of, for reasons that were different from Cal's in their specifics and identical in their structure. 2 people who had both closed the same door, finding each other in the aftermath and trying to figure out together how to open it. The parallel was not accidental. The Force, which does not arrange things with the precision of a planner, but which does seem to bring people with complementary wounds into proximity with some consistency, had apparently decided that these 2 particular severances belonged in the same room. Seri Junda had her own version of the severed connection, and its specifics illuminate something about how the Force's loss expresses itself differently in different people. She'd cut herself off from the Force after her own capture and interrogation by the Empire, an experience whose details she did not share easily, but whose consequence was visible in the specific quality of her relationship with her own capabilities. She had been a Jedi Knight of considerable power, and power in a situation of total powerlessness can become its own wound, can become the thing you cut away because it was there when it should have helped, and didn't. Her severance was not the severance of a child in shock. It was a decision made by an adult who had experienced the full weight of what the Force could and could not do, and had decided that the cost of carrying it was currently higher than the cost of setting it down. The 2 of them, Cal and Seri, were teaching each other things about recovery that neither could have learned alone, because recovery from Force-sensitive severance, like most genuine recovery, requires a witness. The Inquisitor who hunted Cal across multiple worlds, the second sister who had once been Trilla Suduri, who had once been a Padawan who carried the same hopes and the same training that Cal carried, represents the road not taken in a way that he could not fully absorb at the time. She was not a cautionary tale. She was a person who'd been broken by forces she had not been prepared to withstand, who'd been rebuilt by people with interests in her breaking, who had become, through a process that was neither her fault entirely, nor entirely outside her choices, the thing being sent to destroy the person she might have been. When the confrontation between them finally came to its conclusion, the weight of what she represented, not a villain but a warning, not an enemy but a mirror, was the weight that Cal would carry forward into whatever came next. Cal Kestis, by the end of his story's first chapter, had not resolved his grief. That is important to understand. He had not finished mourning Jaro Tapal. He had not made peace with Order 66, or with the years on Breka, or with the specific quality of the wound that comes from watching someone die for you when you were too young to be given that gift wisely. What he had done was something more modest and more real than resolution. He had returned to the Force, imperfectly and with full awareness of the cost of the returning, and he had agreed to continue the education his master had begun on the assumption that the education was still worth continuing. He had decided that Jaro Tapal's sacrifice had been real, and that refusing to become what the sacrifice had purchased was not a form of grieving, but a form of waste. That is not peace, but it is a beginning. The Bracca rigger and the Jedi Padawan and the young man standing in the wreckage of an Imperial facility with a newly lit lightsaber, these were the same person, finally. Not reconciled, not healed. Simply the same person at last, carrying all of it without pretending any of it was not there. And beginnings that start from that kind of honesty, in a galaxy that had tried very hard to foreclose them, carry a weight that the word beginning does not adequately capture. There is a kind of grief that has no institution behind it, no ceremony, no community of shared mourners who understand exactly what has been lost because they have lost the same thing. It is the grief of the person who stood outside the door when the fire started, who is not inside, burning with the others, but who is also not simply a bystander. Ahsoka Tano carries this grief with a particularity that no other survivor shares, because her relationship with the Jedi Order's ending was shaped by a separation that had already happened, a wound that was both earlier and differently shaped than the one Order 66 made in everyone else. Let the night hold this with you. It is not a straightforward kind of sorrow. She had left the Order 6 months before the Empire was born. The circumstances of that leaving are themselves a story about injustice and institutional failure, and the specific damage done when a system that claims to be built on wisdom and discernment fails a person in a way that exposes how much of the wisdom was performance and how much of the discernment was convenience. She'd been accused of a crime she did not commit. She'd been stripped of her status and her rank and her place in the community she had known since childhood, while the Council, including Anakin, her master, though his resistance was more vocal than the others, allowed the proceedings to move forward with the specific helplessness of people constrained by systems they had not examined critically enough to recognize as inadequate. She was eventually exonerated. The exoneration came with an offer to return, as if the offer were a form of apology adequate to what the accusation had cost. It was not. She walked away. Anakin stood in the temple's entrance and watched her go, and the look on his face contained the whole complexity of what he was. A man who loved her, who had failed her, who understood that both things were true, and who could not find a way to make the second one not matter. She walked away from the Jedi Order and from the white robes and from the lightsabers she had carried since she was a child and from the community that had been the only home she had known since she was 3 years old. She walked toward, she did not know what. She walked toward the gap that opens up when everything you are organized around is suddenly optional. This means that when Order 66 came, Ahsoka Tano was not in the system that was being dismantled. She had no Jedi identification in the Imperial databases. She had handed back her lightsabers. She was, in the Empire's new registry of threats, a former Jedi, a category the early Imperial bureaucracy had not yet fully developed a response to, as compared to the more immediately recognizable threat of a current one. This gave her a specific and narrow window of initial safety that no other survivor possessed in quite the same form. She was already invisible to most of the machinery designed to find her, because she had already, months earlier, stepped out of the light it was built to track. But she could feel it. She was not dead to the Force, and the Force was not dead to her. And when the purge happened, she felt it with the same devastating clarity that every Force-sensitive being felt it. The reduction, the sudden diminishment, the web of living connection between all the Jedi becoming measurably thinner in a single night. She felt the deaths of people she had trained beside, whose presence in the Force she had known her entire life, whose particular qualities in the living web were as recognizable to her as faces. She felt them go out one after another, the way you feel a candle go out in a room you thought was warm. Not just the loss of light, but the drop in temperature, the specific cold that follows warmth's removal. And she felt Anakin, not his death, which had not happened, but his transformation, which was perhaps worse. She felt something in the Force that had been her master become something else, darker, stranger, structured differently. The warmth that had characterized his presence replaced by something that still had his power and his intelligence, but had lost the thing underneath both of those that had made him himself. She faked her death with deliberate care, because Ahsoka Tano had always been more tactically creative than people who underestimated her expected, and because she understood from the moment the purge happened that her visibility, even her already reduced visibility, was still too much. She left her lightsabers on a moon that the Empire would find. She let the scene speak the story she needed told, a confrontation, an ending, a Jedi dead among the wreckage of a crashed cruiser. She walked away from it into an anonymity that was more complete than anything she had managed before, because this time it was not just institutional invisibility. This time it was deliberate erasure. Ahsoka Tano, the record said, was dead. The person who had been Ahsoka Tano could become someone the record had no entry for. The years between her faked death and her emergence as Fulcrum are the years about which the least is known and the most can be inferred. She moved through the galaxy's underworld and its agricultural fringes and its refugee populations, carrying no lightsabers and no Jedi title, helping where she could in ways that did not draw attention to the specific nature of her capabilities. She was not idle. She was also not the Ahsoka who had walked out of the temple. That person was being remade slowly, by the accumulation of years and choices and the specific education that comes from living outside the structure of everything that previously defined you. She was learning what she was when she was only herself. No order, no master, no institutional identity, only Ahsoka. Fulcrum emerged when the rebellion needed her to. This is how she always described it. Not as a decision she made, but as a response to a circumstance, the Force and the situation together creating the conditions under which not acting became less acceptable than acting. She became an intelligence operative for the growing network of cells that would eventually become the Rebel Alliance, using her knowledge of Imperial operations and her Force sensitivity in service of an organized resistance. She operated under a code name. She communicated through encrypted channels. She was, to the people she worked with, a voice and a set of coordinates and a reliable source of actionable intelligence. She was, in all operational senses, invisible, and she was doing more good invisible than she had done in years of visible service. Her eventual reunion with Kanan and Ezra, her re-entry into a world that contained people who knew what she was and what she had been, is one of the most quietly significant moments in the story of the surviving Jedi, precisely because of what it did not resolve. She did not return to the Jedi Order because there was no Jedi Order to return to. She did not become Ezra's master because that role was Kanan's and she understood the specific importance of not displacing it. She was Ahsoka, former Padawan, former commander, current fulcrum, perpetually complicated, carrying the weight of a grief that had two distinct and non-identical layers. The grief of having left the family before it died, and the grief of having watched it die from outside, without the terrible intimacy of being inside it. She went eventually to face Darth Vader, not because she was certain it was wise, and not because she had resolved the emotional question of who Darth Vader was in relation to the person she had known. She went because leaving him behind, leaving Anakin Skywalker behind in the wreckage of what he had become, without bearing witness to it fully, was not something she could do and remain fully herself. The confrontation on Malachor, in the ancient Sith temple with its history of devastation humming under every stone, was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a reckoning, a refusal to allow the story of who Anakin Skywalker had been and what he had become to go unwitnessed by someone who had loved him. She did not die there. The Force, or time, or the specific mercy of a moment Vader allowed that he perhaps should not have allowed, gave her back. But she came out of it changed, because that is what bearing witness to the full truth of a person's transformation does. It changes the witness. The name fulcrum was itself a statement. A fulcrum is the fixed point on which a lever turns, the thing that does not move, around which movement becomes possible. Ahsoka chose it with the specific intention of someone who understands that names are not arbitrary, that what you call yourself shapes what you become available to be. She was not a Jedi, and she was not a soldier, and she was not a political leader, and she was not any of the categories the rebellion was building its structure around. She was the fixed point, the thing that held still while others moved, the thing that connected without becoming any of the things it connected. It was, in its way, the most honestly Jedi name she had yet carried, more accurate than the title she'd been given as a Padawan, because it described what she actually did, rather than what an institution had decided she was. Her intelligence work required her to maintain contact with cells that had no knowledge of each other, to be a node in a network whose security depended on its nodes not knowing the full shape of the network. She communicated through encrypted channels, through dead drops, through the specific tradecraft of people who've learned to pass information without leaving the evidence of the passing. She was extraordinarily good at this. The skills that made her exceptional as a Jedi, the Force sensitivity that let her read intention and emotion with accuracy that exceeded ordinary perception, the tactical intelligence that had made her a respected commander before she was fully trained, the specific quality of attention that Anakin had modelled for her and that she had internalized and then made her own, translated directly into excellence at an intelligence role that had nothing to do with the temple's traditional Jedi functions. She had been trained for something specific. She had found a way to apply the training to something different. This is the definition of adaptability, and it is not a quality the temple had explicitly cultivated, which is perhaps why it was the quality the survivors needed most. Ahsoka Tano is not a Jedi. She has said this plainly, and the saying is not humility or denial, but accuracy. She carries Jedi training. She is Force-sensitive in a way that exceeds most Jedi she's known. She has a lightsaber, white-bladed, made from crystals she purified herself. The white a deliberate statement about alignment that is also a statement about independence. Not the blue of a Jedi, Not the red of an inquisitor, but her own colour, earned in her own way, with its own meaning that belongs to no tradition but her. She survived the purge as an outsider to what was purged, and she survived the Empire as participant in what defeated it, and she has carried the grief and the purpose and the specific complication of her position through decades of living that would have broken someone who had less of her particular quality of endurance. She is, in the end, the clearest illustration of a truth the Jedi Order never fully institutionalized, that the Force does not require a title. It requires only a person willing to carry it honestly. Let the breath come even slower now. You're deep in the night, deep in the story, and there is no urgency here. Nothing that needs to be done with what you're receiving. Think of a library, very old, with walls that have absorbed the sound of generations of quiet. Think of the specific stillness that accumulates in a place where knowledge has been kept carefully, where the act of preservation has been repeated so many times that it has become a form of architecture. The story now moves to the places and the people who understood that survival alone was not enough, that what the Jedi had learned over 1,000 years needed to be carried forward, not just in living bodies but in deliberate memory, or it would be lost. Obi-Wan Kenobi went to Tatooine. This choice, which reads on its surface as the simplest of the available options, a remote desert world, far from the trade routes, far from imperial administrative priority, a planet whose primary cultural contribution to the galaxy was an annual record for extreme temperatures and a secondary contribution in the form of the Hutt criminal infrastructure, was not as simple as it looked. He went there because of a child. Not his child, and not the child's proximity in the simple sense, but proximity in the more complex sense. He went because a boy named Luke Skywalker was being raised on Tatooine by a moisture farmer and his wife, and Obi-Wan had been given a responsibility in relation to that boy that was the last coherent task remaining from everything the Republic had been. He lived in a hut in the Yundland wastes. He did not practice his lightsaber forms openly. He did not make himself known to the settlers around him beyond what passing contact required. He became, to the people of the nearest community, Ben, an eccentric hermit in the desert, strange in the harmless way that desert hermits are traditionally strange, someone you might ask for help in a genuine emergency, but who you did not invite to dinner and did not expect to fully understand. He cultivated this impression carefully, because the impression was protection, for him, and more importantly for the boy, who needed to grow up unaware that he was being watched over in order to grow up at all. What Obi-Wan did in the Yunnan wastes, in the years between Mustafar and the day Luke walked into his hut looking for a droid, was wait. This description understates it. He meditated. He maintained his connection with the Force in the careful, sustained way of someone who understands that the connection is not automatic but is a practice, requiring attention and time and the willingness to be present with what the Force brings, rather than only with what you want it to bring. He studied, he communicated in ways that the Force makes possible between master and student even across the distance of death. With Qui-Gon Jinn, a conversation that had been interrupted by a Sith apprentice's blade on Naboo, and that Qui-Gon, in the luminous form that the living Force permitted, had apparently decided was not finished. He learned things in that desert that he had not known how to learn before. The patience of waiting, it turns out, is one of the Force's most demanding curricula. Yoda went to Dagobah, which requires a different kind of understanding than Tatooine does. Tatooine is a hard planet, dry and bright and mercilessly hot, a world that kills the inattentive and rewards only the disciplined. Dagobah is something else, a world that is entirely alive, so densely populated with living things that the Force is thick there, almost visible, almost audible, the web of all living things expressing itself in a swamp that has never been fully mapped because it resists mapping, because every path shifts, because the living world here is not background but foreground, not setting but substance. For a being whose entire life had been spent in relationship with the Force, Dagobah was a specific kind of home, the kind that could sustain deep practice without any of the institutional support that the temple had provided, because the planet itself was, in some sense, the institution. He trained Luke there, eventually. But before Luke, there were years, over 2 decades, of Yoda alone on Dagobah, 900 years old and carrying the full weight of the Jedi Order's ending, doing the work of maintenance and preparation that no one could witness and no record would hold. He maintained the practices, he kept the forms, he continued to teach himself, to develop and refine and go deeper into the Force's teachings, because stopping would have meant consenting to the Empire's premise that the Jedi were finished. He did not consent to this. He had always been slower than his contemporaries to accept that something was over when he believed it was not. The stubbornness of great age directed toward a purpose that still had not been fulfilled is a formidable thing. The archives were not all destroyed. This is a fact the Empire would have preferred to prevent and did not entirely manage. The Temple's main archive burned. Scrolls and holocrons and data crystals and the written records of 1,000 years of Jedi scholarship, reduced in hours to ash and slag that the cleanup crews swept into containers and disposed of without examining, because examining it would have required acknowledging what it had been. But the Jedi had always understood that knowledge stored in one place is knowledge that can be destroyed in one action, and the Order's history included enough destructions to have produced, in its more cautious members, the habit of distributed preservation. Copies existed. Not of everything, not even of most things, but of some things carefully chosen. Holocrons were among the most important of these, and they were built for exactly this kind of contingency. A holocron was not merely a storage device. It was a teaching instrument, shaped from kyber crystal and designed to communicate with Force-sensitive users in a way that adjusted to the specific user, presenting information at the appropriate depth and responding to questions with the encoded intelligence of the Jedi who had constructed it. A good holocron carried something of its maker's presence, not their ghost, not their consciousness in full, but a quality of their way of thinking, their particular approach to the Force's questions, their voice in the specific sense of a style that was recognizably theirs. A survivor who found a holocron found not just information, but a form of contact with what had been lost. Jocasta Nu, the Temple's chief librarian, made her own choice about the archives in the aftermath of the Purge, a choice that speaks to a particular kind of courage that is less celebrated than the combat variety but is in some ways more demanding. She returned to Coruscant. She went back to the Imperial-occupied temple. She moved through its corridors under the occupation with the specific fluency of someone who had spent decades knowing every passage and every access point, and she attempted to retrieve the most irreplaceable items from what remained of the archive before the Imperials could fully catalogue what they had. She understood the danger. She had calculated the danger against the value of what she was trying to save and had arrived at an answer that required her to go back into the most dangerous building on the most heavily monitored world in the galaxy. This is what the commitment to knowledge looks like when it is not metaphorical. Think, for a moment, about what was being preserved in all of these actions, In Obi-Wan's desert meditations, in Yoda's Dagobah vigil, in the hidden holocrons and the distributed fragments of the archive. It was not merely information, it was a way of being in relationship with the living universe. The specific quality of the Jedi tradition, the practices, the philosophy, the understanding of the Force as something that connects rather than separates, that asks for service rather than domination, that runs toward the light not because darkness is forbidden, but because light is what a healthy relationship with the Force naturally produces. This quality was what was being kept alive in the desert and the swamp and the scattered hiding places across the galaxy. Not the institution, not the hierarchy, not the political standing or the Senate seat or the diplomatic role, the understanding itself. Qui-Gon Jinn had been dead for over a decade when Obi-Wan began to hear him in the desert, which is to say, Qui-Gon had been physically dead, had died on the floor of a Naboo reactor shaft at the blade of a Sith apprentice, had been mourned and eulogized and released. What he had discovered, in whatever existence follows the physical one for a being whose connection to the Force is deep enough, was the technique of retaining consciousness in the living Force after death, not as a ghost or a haunting, but as a presence that could be reached through the same deep meditative practice that Jedi had always used to commune with the Force's more subtle dimensions. He had discovered this not through the Jedi tradition, but through his own investigation, guided by a being called the Force Priestesses on a world called Mortis that existed in a space adjacent to physical reality. He had brought this knowledge back, incompletely, and in the years after his death had continued the work of understanding it, until he could teach it to Yoda, and Yoda could teach it to Obi-Wan, and the knowledge of how to persist in the Force beyond death became itself a form of preservation, the most personal and most intimate form, the self as its own archive. The texts on Ahch-To, which Luke would one day find in the library tree at the base of the first Jedi Temple, were among the oldest records in the Order's possession, so old that the script they were written in required specific training to read, so old that their contents reflected a relationship with the Force that predated many of the Jedi Order's later codifications. They had been there long before the Empire. They had been there long before the high period of the Republic. They'd been surviving through catastrophes that made the Empire look recent. There is something in that persistence that deserves to be acknowledged without being sentimentalized. Paper survives when people do not sometimes, and the knowledge encoded in old texts can outlast the institutions that created them and the civilizations that housed those institutions, because knowledge written down in a dry place with careful hands can wait a very long time for someone who needs it to arrive. Luke Skywalker would walk into Obi-Wan's hut on Tatooine knowing nothing of this, and would find himself handed a lightsaber that had belonged to his father before the father became something his son could not yet understand. He would train on Dagobah with a small green being who had been keeping the flame of the Order alive for 23 years in a swamp, having lived 9 centuries, having watched the galaxy's greatest achievement and its greatest failure, both, having arrived through all of it at a kind of wisdom that does not look like wisdom from the outside, but that, in practice, is exactly what was needed for exactly this moment. He would carry what they gave him forward, imperfectly and with great cost, into a confrontation that none of the surviving Jedi had been willing to believe was possible. The confrontation that ended an empire and turned a Sith Lord back toward the light with the specific, unrepeatable power of a son's refusal to give up on his father. None of that was guaranteed. None of it was planned. All of it grew from seeds planted in deserts and swamps and hidden compartments over the long years of the Empire's confident permanence. The knowledge survived, not intact, not complete, but present enough and carried by people who had paid enough for it to be passed on, and passing on in the end is the only immortality available to anything that matters. Let the stillness deepen. You are far enough into the night now that the surface of things has gone quiet, and what remains is the slower, more essential rhythm underneath, the breath, the heartbeat, the low hum of being present in a body that has been resting long enough to remember what rest actually is. We are going to the edges of the story now, to the people who could not be categorized by the Order's definitions, who survived the Purge in ways that the Purge was not entirely designed to account for, because they had already been living outside the categories the Purge was built to eliminate. Their stories are the ones that ask the hardest questions about what the Jedi Order was and what it was not, and the questions are worth holding even when they do not resolve. The Jedi Order had a relationship with its own edges that was, for most of its history, uncomfortable. The Order was built on a philosophy of clarity, on the idea that the Force, properly understood and properly practiced, moved in a particular direction, toward the light, toward service, toward the release of attachment in favor of presence. This philosophy was not wrong exactly, but its institutional expression produced a rigidity that sometimes confused the map with the territory. A Jedi who felt the pull of the dark side but chose the light was, within the philosophy, doing exactly the right thing. But the Order's response to such a Jedi was often more complicated, more watchful, more cautious, more inclined to see the acknowledgement of darkness as itself a form of proximity to it. The result was a culture in which the most honest practitioners were sometimes the most scrutinized, and in which pretending to a serenity you did not feel was, functionally, safer than admitting to the struggle. Quinlan Vos lived on the edge of this problem for most of his career, and the edge suited him in the way that edges suit people who were born facing outward. He was a Jedi who used his Force abilities in the underworld, as an investigator, as an operative in environments that the Order's more conventional practitioners did not easily navigate, moving through criminal organizations and black markets, and the specific moral ambiguity of a galaxy where the line between legal and illegal was drawn by people with interests rather than principles. He was not above using methods the Council would have found troubling. He was also genuinely and consistently on the side that was trying to protect the living rather than harm them. The Council watched him the way you watch a river that is running close to its banks, with respect for what it is doing and careful attention to what it might do. He survived Order 66. The specific mechanics of his survival belong to the category of stories that depend on being in the right-wrong place at the right-wrong time. But the larger story of how Quinlan Vos survived the Empire is a story about flexibility, about the specific survival advantage of having spent your entire career operating in spaces where the rules were already provisional, where your identity was already a managed performance, where the skills of being someone that no official record accurately described were the skills you practiced daily rather than the skills you had to learn in crisis. He had been living the hidden life before he had to. When everyone had to, he was, if not exactly prepared, at least not starting from nothing. The Grey Jedi, a term the Order never officially accepted and its members used with varying degrees of seriousness, were practitioners who had concluded that the strict Jedi prohibition on emotional attachment was not the only defensible position in the philosophical territory the Force opened up. They did not embrace the dark side. This distinction matters enormously and gets routinely lost in the summary. The Grey Jedi were not fallen Jedi, not practitioners of Sith philosophy, not people who had decided that power through domination was acceptable. They were people who had decided that love, specific, named, particular love for specific people, was not inherently incompatible with the Force's service. They paid for this position in their standing with the Order. Some of them paid for it in ways that proved the Order's caution was not entirely without basis, but some of them proved that the position was sustainable, and the proof was their survival and continued service. Luminara Undul's Padawan, Barriss Offee, represents a different kind of edge story, one that does not resolve comfortably and should not be made to. Barriss had been a model Padawan in every externally observable way, disciplined, compassionate, devoted to healing, deeply respectful of the Order's values. Inside, she had been accumulating a critique of the Order that she could not voice, watching the Clone Wars turn the Jedi from guardians of peace into generals, in a conflict that seemed to her to corrupt the very thing it claimed to protect. When she acted on that critique, she acted in ways that were indefensible, ways that caused real harm to real people, including Ahsoka Tano, and her eventual fate, captured and likely imprisoned at the time the Empire rose, is one of the story's genuine ambiguities. She had seen something real. She'd responded to it wrongly. The combination does not produce a clean verdict, and the lack of a clean verdict is itself a kind of truth. Sit with that for a moment. The Order was not infallible. The institutions built to protect wisdom are themselves capable of the rigidities that prevent wisdom from fully operating. The Jedi were extraordinary. Their commitment to service, their centuries of accumulated knowledge, their relationship with the Force. And they were also an institution with all of the tendencies that institutions have towards self-preservation and the conflation of their own continued existence with the purpose they were built to serve. The survivors who emerged from the Purge carrying critiques of the Order they had loved were not wrong to carry them. The critiques did not justify the Purge. They did not redeem Palpatine's calculation. But they were real, and the rebuilding of anything like a Jedi tradition would have to reckon with them honestly to avoid recreating the same vulnerabilities. The Night Sisters of Dathomir occupy a category that resists most of the available frameworks for thinking about the Force. Their tradition, old, matriarchal, rooted in a connection with the Force that their practice called magic rather than the Force, but that drew on the same living web, was not Jedi and not Sith, and not simply a third option on an axis between them. It was something older, shaped by a planet and a culture that had developed in relative isolation, that had its own values and its own taboos and its own understanding of what the living energy of the universe was for. The Night Sisters were, by the time of the Clone Wars, nearly destroyed, not by the Purge, but by a different imperial project, one that predated the Empire's formal proclamation. Maul's role in that destruction is one of the story's most complex threads, and complexity here is not aestheticization of violence, but accurate recognition that the galaxy's wrongs radiated outward from the central catastrophe in directions that did not always follow the expected paths. Merrin, who survived the Night Sister massacre and lived for years alone on Dathomir, carrying her tradition in her own body as the last of her kind, her story intersects with Cal Kestis's in ways that illuminate something important about what survival does to the people who practice it. She was not waiting for rescue. She was not maintaining hope in the conventional sense of that word, the sense that implies the future will bring something better. She was living in the ruins of everything she had known, using the skills her tradition had given her in whatever way was available, carrying the grief of her people's destruction in the specific way that last survivors carry it, not as something that will be shared and diluted among many, but as a weight that belongs entirely to you, that cannot be distributed. when she eventually chose to leave Dathomir and join something larger than her own maintenance, the choice had the quality of genuine agency rather than desperation. She was not saved. She decided to go. What connects these Edgewalkers, Quinlan Vos, the Grey Practitioners, the Night Sisters, the ones who'd always been too complicated for the Order's preferred categories, is that the Empire's purge hit them differently than it hit the Order's core. Some were safer because they were already invisible to the systems that hunted Jedi. Some were more vulnerable because they had no community left to run to. Some found, in the aftermath, that the skills their difference had forced them to develop were exactly the skills that survival required. The Order's edges, in other words, turned out to be the places where the most adaptive survival was possible. Not because the edges were better than the centre, but because the edges had been living with uncertainty longer, had been practicing the navigation of ambiguous terrain, had already learned that no single institution defines the Force, and that no single loss, however enormous, is the same as the loss of everything. The Bendu, a being who described himself as the one in the middle, belonging to neither the light nor the dark, existed as a living philosophical challenge to the categories that both the Jedi and the Sith had spent millennia constructing and defending. Ancient and strange and anchored to a world in the Outer Rim, the Bendu had been at this long enough to find the binary dispute between light-siders and dark-siders somewhat wearying, like someone who has watched the same argument recur in different forms for so many centuries that the argument itself has become more interesting than either of its positions. When he encountered Kanan Jarrus, a Jedi who had spent 15 years trying not to be a Jedi, who had arrived at his middle years carrying wounds in precisely the places where the Jedi tradition said wounds should not be, the meeting had the quality of a long river finally reaching the delta it had been moving toward without knowing it. The Bendu taught Kanan something about the Force that the Temple had not taught, which was that the Force did not require that you have no fear. It required only that you not be governed by it. Ezra Bridger's own journey toward the edge is worth noting here, because it illustrates something important about what the hidden Jedi were protecting against, as much as what they were protecting. Ezra was drawn toward the dark side through a door that the Sith tradition has always known how to keep open. The door of loss, the specific anguish of a person who has watched people they love suffer and has been told that the Force could help them if only they would stop limiting it with their restraint. The holocron of the Sith. Holocron whispered to him with a particular voice that darkness uses when it addresses grief. Not the voice of malice, but the voice of relief. The voice that says there is a way to fix this. There is a way to stop the loss. You only need to let go of the thing that is holding you back from the power that would let you prevent it. Kanan's presence, imperfect and hard-won, was the counterweight. The Jedi tradition that Kanan had almost lost and then recovered was the thing that held Ezra to a different gravity, and that holding was itself the justification for the years of cost that the recovery of that tradition had required. The night is very deep now. Let the breath be slow. These are the stories that resist conclusion, that do not end with the victory that resolves everything, with the lesson that explains everything, with the moment that makes the decades of loss and adaptation feel earned, in the clean way that we sometimes want difficult things to feel earned. These Edgewalkers were not redeemed by the Empire's eventual fall in a way that made their years of survival feel retrospectively purposeful. They survived because they survived, and because the Force moved in their favour, and because they made choices that kept them alive when other choices would not have. What they did with those lives, that is a separate question, and the answers are as various as the people giving them. That variousness is not a failure of the story. It is the story. The Force does not produce uniform outcomes. It produces living ones. Let everything slow now. Let the thoughts that have been moving through you tonight, the images, the names, the accumulated weight of all these stories told in the long dark, let them begin to settle, the way sediment settles in still water, drifting down through the layers until it comes to rest at the bottom where things are held without effort. You have travelled very far tonight, through the purge and the escape and the desert and the swamp and the corridors of hidden lives, through grief and adaptation and the long, unglamorous work of carrying something forward in the dark. The story is not over. But this is where we rest. Luke Skywalker stood on Tatooine with a lightsaber in his hand that he did not yet know how to use and a destiny he did not yet know he was carrying. And an old man with kind eyes handed him both and said, in the plainest possible language, that the Force was something he was already a part of, that it had been in his family before it was in him, that the galaxy was large, and the darkness in it was real, and that he was not, despite the evidence of his very ordinary morning on a very ordinary moisture farm, going to spend the rest of his life watching it from a distance. He was 19 years old. He had never heard of Order 66. He did not know the name Depa Billaba, or Jaro Tapal, or any of the people who had died, so that the tradition being handed to him had survived to be handed. He just felt the weight of the saber in his hands and the strange familiar quality of the Force as it began, tentatively, to acknowledge his presence in it. This is what survives the fire. Not the archive entire, not the full curriculum of the Temple's 1,000-year pedagogy, not the specific forms in all their depth and refinement, not the accumulated political wisdom of 1,000 diplomatic engagements, not the full catalogue of holocron knowledge that Jocasta Nu had spent her career maintaining. What survives is enough. An old man in a desert who had been keeping something alive for 23 years. A small being in a swamp who'd been keeping something alive for 900. The Force itself, which does not require institutional maintenance, and which had been, through all the years of the Empire, flowing through every living thing regardless of whether any living thing was paying attention to it. What survives is also Grogu, a child of Yoda's species, old enough to have been at the temple on the night the 501st came through its doors, young enough that the memories of it are more sensation than narrative. Warmth, then sudden cold, then the particular darkness of hiding that is also somehow safe. He was taken from the temple by someone, carried through the chaos of the purge by a person, or persons whose identity has not been fully recovered, handed forward through the years until he ended up in the care of a Mandalorian bounty hunter who had never expected to have a foundling and who turned out to be, improbably and completely, exactly what Grogu needed. The Force does not guarantee the straightforward path, but it seems to have a preference for keeping alive the things it has invested in by whatever improbable means are available. What survives is Rey, a person who should, by the Empire's logic, have had no access to the Jedi tradition at all. The Jedi were dead. The temple was gone. The surviving masters were dead or in hiding. And yet the Force is not bounded by institutional access, and the knowledge that had been distributed through the surviving practitioners and the hidden holocrons and the texts on H2 and the specific, irreducible fact of Luke Skywalker's continued existence in it. All of this conspired to ensure that when Rey reached out her hand on a snowy forest floor, the lightsaber that flew to it was a lightsaber whose tradition was not extinct, diminished, altered, changed by everything it had been through, but not extinct. There is a Jedi tradition, old enough that its origins were not clearly known even to the scholars of the Temple Archive, of sending a message into the Force at the moment of death, not a communication to a specific person, but a general release, a pouring of knowledge and identity back into the living web from which it came. The Jedi understood themselves as temporary expressions of the Force's long continuity, and this understanding had a corollary, that what they had learned and felt and lived was not theirs to keep but theirs to return, like water that has cycled through a particular landscape and then rejoins the aquifer. Some survivors in the years of the Empire practiced this in a different form, not at death but daily, in their meditations, releasing what they knew into the Force as a form of deposit, trusting that the Force would hold it, and that someday, somewhere, a person with the right sensitivity and the right stillness would encounter it and recognize it as something that had been sent to them across a distance they could not measure. This is not a metaphor. The Force is not a metaphor. It is the condition of all living things, and what is released into it persists. The children who were Force-sensitive under the Empire grew up with no language for what they felt. They felt the warmth of the living web, the connection to growing things and to the emotions of people around them, the occasional bright clarity of a moment when perception exceeded what the ordinary senses provided. And they had no framework for any of it, no community of understanding, no elder who could say, "Yes, this is real, this is what it is, you are not strange, you belong to something." Some of them were found by the Inquisitors. Some of them were found by people who recognized what they had and protected it, quietly, in the specific way that communities protect the things that powerful institutions want to eliminate. Some of them grew up and found their way to the Force on their own, by paths so individual and so improbable that the Force's continuity through them reads less as plan than as the persistence of something that cannot be entirely suppressed regardless of what tries to suppress it. There is a Jedi tradition, old enough that its origins were not clearly known even to the scholars of the Temple Archive, of sending a message into the Force at the moment of death. Not a communication to a specific person, but a general release, a pouring of knowledge and identity back into the living web from which it came. The Jedi understood themselves as temporary expressions of the Force's long continuity, and this understanding had a corollary, that what they had learned and felt and lived was not theirs to keep, but theirs to return, like water that has cycled through a particular landscape and then rejoins the aquifer. Some survivors, in the years of the Empire, practiced this in a different form, not at death but daily, in their meditations, releasing what they knew into the Force as a form of deposit, trusting that the Force would hold it and that someday, somewhere, a person with the right sensitivity and the right stillness would encounter it and recognize it as something that had been sent to them across a distance they could not measure. This is not a metaphor. The Force is not a metaphor. It is the condition of all living things, and what is released into it persists. Pause here, at the threshold of sleep, and consider what that means. The Galactic Empire deployed the full institutional force of a galactic government toward the project of eliminating a tradition. It killed thousands of trained practitioners. It destroyed the Central Archive. It hunted the survivors for decades with specialized operatives trained for exactly that purpose. It rewrote the historical record to describe the Jedi as enemies of the peace. It raised an entire generation on worlds that had never had contact with a living Jedi, for whom the Order was mythology and rumor, for whom the Force was a concept rather than an experience. It did all of this, and the tradition survived, not in the form it had taken before, not with the same institutional structure, the same hierarchy, the same political standing, but the essential thing, the understanding that the Force connects all living things and that a person in genuine relationship with it is capable of something extraordinary, that survived. There is quality in the Force that the Sith philosophy fundamentally misunderstands, and the misunderstanding is at the root of every Sith failure across the millennia of recorded history. The Force is not a resource to be controlled. It is not a power to be accumulated. It does not become more yours the more you dominate it. The Sith model treats the Force the way the Empire treated the galaxy, as something to be seized and held and bent to a will that is stronger than the thing being bent, and the Force, which is not a thing that can be seized, which is more like weather than like an object, simply moves around the grasping hand and continues. It continues through the people who are carrying it honestly, through the deserts and the swamps and the hidden compartments under floors, through the quiet years when no one is watching and nothing appears to be happening. It continues. This is not sentimentality. It is the record of what actually occurred. The breath has slowed now. You can feel the weight of sleep beginning to come. That specific heaviness in the face and the hands that means the body has decided to let the day go. Let it go. The stories you've been carrying tonight are not yours to hold indefinitely. They are stories about holding things through long nights, about keeping faith with something in the dark, about the particular courage it takes to survive not as a triumph, but as a form of service to a future you cannot guarantee. These are good stories to carry into sleep. They do not require resolution. They only require being held gently, the way you hold anything that matters, without clutching. Somewhere, in a galaxy very far away and a long time ago, a Jedi breathed. In a forest, in a desert, in a swamp, on a salvage world, aboard a rebel ship, in a market on a world whose name the Empire never found important enough to record. They breathed, and the Force moved through them, and the morning came. Not every morning was safe. Not every morning was a step towards something better. But the morning came, and they were in it, and they carried what they carried, and eventually they passed it on. That is the whole of the miracle, and it is enough. It is exactly enough. Let the eyes be heavy now. Let the thoughts lose their edges, the way thoughts do in the last minutes before sleep, becoming images rather than arguments, feelings rather than narratives, the gentle nonsense of a mind releasing its grip on the day. You do not need to carry anything into sleep tonight. The stories will be here when you return. The Force will be here when you return, moving through all living things as it always has, indifferent to empires and patient beyond the capacity of any empire to outlast. Rest now. The night is doing what nights do, which is holding everything that needs to be held without being asked. Let it hold you too. If you find yourself drifting, let yourself go. There is nothing left to do tonight. The Guardians kept their faith in the dark, and the morning came, and what was carried was received, and what was lost was mourned, and what survived was enough. Sleep well. The stars are still there. The Force is still there. You are still here. That is, in the end, the only story that ever really needed to be told, and it has been told tonight in all the ways it needed to be told. Close your eyes. Let go. The story knows how to keep itself.